10 years ago, my dad and I built my first gaming PC. It had an AMD Phenom II X4 940 Black Edition, 16 gigs of DDR2 RAM, and this, the SAPPHIRE Radeon HD 5770, an entry-level card made by ATI on October 2009 for $160 aimed to compete against the GTX 260, equipped with 1GB of GDDR5 VRAM and a clock speed of 850 MHz. And today, we'll see how it'll fare in 2020. For our test bench, we're going to pair our GPU with an Intel Core i7 3770, 16 gigs of DDR3 memory, and we're going to be testing our system against Dota 2, CSGO, PUBG, GTA 5, Civilization 6, Overwatch, Monster Hunter World, NBA 2K20, Witcher 3, League of Legends, and Valorant. Most of these will be ran in their lowest settings except for League, Dota 2, and Valorant. Starting with Dota 2, on best looking settings, instead of playing a game and potentially ruining it for 9 other people, we watched the second game between EG and Team Secret at the Dream League Major back in January 2020. We watched the team fight around the 30-minute mark to really get an idea of how the card performs when all the particles from the abilities are used. The GPU averaged about 34 FPS during the entire team fight and a 1% and 0.1% low of 25 and 17 FPS respectively, showing that on a much lower setting you're going to be able to squeeze out a lot more out of the GPU, which is actually surprising. You still won't get that 60 frames per second sweet spot, but considering its age and its target market, entry-level gamers back in 2009, it's surprising that it handled this esports title very well. Moving on to CSGO, we applied the same methodology we did with Dota 2 and watched map 1 of the 2019 Katowice Major Grand Finals between Australis and on the game's lowest settings at 1080p. Throughout the match, the GPU was only able to handle about 35 frames per second on average, and even with CSGO being a CPU intensive title, the GPU simply could not keep up at 1080p. Up next is PUBG. Playing a quick solo match averaged us at around 26 frames per second, but 1% and 0.1% lows of 15 and 13 FPS respectively. The game was very stuttery from the outset, even at the game's lowest settings at 1080p. Granted, PUBG is notoriously known for its poor optimization, but the poor performance is clearly just due to the age of the graphics card. Our next game is Monster Hunter World, touted for its amazing transition to the PC platform and its cinematic gameplay, but unfortunately our GPU can only also muster up a cinematic 21 frames per second. That's walking around the ancient forest on the game's 1080p lowest setting, and an even lower 19 frames per second once I got to fighting on Argakuga. An interesting tidbit, while I was configuring the game's graphics settings, it was showing me that there wasn't enough VRAM to run the game at 1080p low, as it required 2GB of VRAM to run at that setting, but the game still ran, although it was more like walking with how it looked. Clearly, the 1GB of VRAM is such a bottleneck with the modern titles that we'll see this occur quite a few times with the AAA titles. Moving on to Witcher 3 on its lowest 1080p setting with hairworks off, another game touted for its cinematic graphics, and well, another game that ran with cinematic frame rates with our GPU. Just walking around the overworld averaged at around 15 frames per second and was a stuttering mess with 1% and 0.1% lows of 14 and 11 FPS respectively. Moving on next to one of the staples of benchmarking gaming hardware, we're on to GTA 5 on its normal settings, which is the lowest on 1080p. I do have to inform you that the game would not allow me to run these settings on DX11 due to its VRAM limitations, and required us to have 2GB at least, so the tests were run on DX10. Using their built-in benchmarking tool, the game ran all 5 passes at around 55 frames per second, which was really respectable, and the only AAA title that would even run remotely close to 60 FPS. With 1% and 0.1% lows of 36 and 17 respectively, the game would stutter every now and then when there were enough particles to bog down the GPU, but the game was playable. Moving away to more common benchmark games, our next one is NBA 2K20. I put this on here just for the shits and giggles and just to see how well the GPU handled a plethora of game genres. Running a quick match between the Lakers and the Clippers, controlled by bots, the game averaged about 26 frames per second on its lowest 1080p settings. Surprisingly, the game was not as stuttery as I expected, with 1% and 0.1% lows of 23 and 21 respectively. Civ 6 is next on our list of benchmark games, with us running it again on 1080p low. Using their built-in benchmarking tool, the game averaged around 27 FPS. Granted, this isn't one of those games that you really need high FPS numbers on. A smooth 60 FPS on a game like Civ would be more than enough for a satisfying gameplay. Unfortunately, we're not getting that here. 27 frames per second is all the GPU can muster up, but the game was still a playable experience, even with the low frame rate, because it's not really your typical esports title that needs your PC to output data as fast as it can, so you can react faster than your opponent. With Civ, you can just sit back and think as to what your next move is going to be, and the 27 FPS won't be a hindrance. But it is also not a smooth gaming experience. Going back to esports titles, Overwatch was a huge surprise and a testament as to how well optimized the game is. We played a 6v6 quick play match so we wouldn't bother any people that wanted to play a proper game of Overwatch. The game ran around 116 frames per second and 1080p low. It was quite surprising as to how well I ran the game up until the heroes started using their abilities and particles fly about. With 1% and 0.1% lows of 60 and 44 FPS respectively, the stuttering wasn't too bad to a point that the game was unplayable, but it was definitely noticeable. Quite a nice surprise as to how well the GPU performed on Overwatch. Our final two titles are from Riot themselves, and they both ran really well with our 5770. Starting off with League, playing a quick solo queue match, and the reason why I opted to watch replays for my Dota 2 and CSGO benchmarks. Going on a tangent here, esports titles should really have an easy way to benchmark your system, seeing as though this is a fairly common thing that people try and do with their games, and it also gives their player base a better understanding as to what they need in order for them to run the game, at which resolution, settings, and frame rates that they want. Going back on topic, game ran at about 118 frames per second with 1% and 0.1% lows of 90 and 86 respectively. The game was set to 1080p high, and it really surprised me that you could run League of Legends with essentially a potato. If you're looking to build a PC for League, it shouldn't really take much to get you up and running and on the Summoner's Rift. And lastly, Riot's latest title, Valorant. On the game's high settings at 1080p, playing an unrated match ran at 126 frames per second, which is a testament as to how easy it is to get into Riot's games. With 1% and 0.1% lows of 87 and 66 respectively, similar to Overwatch, our stuttering mainly comes from when abilities are used. The game was relatively smooth considering our limitations and the particles that are rendered during the game, and it was a really fun surprise that you can run a game that came out on 2020 with a graphics card that came out 11 years ago. I really commend Riot on how easy it is to get into their games. They don't require much and provide hours of really fun gameplay. With that though, we can definitely conclude that my 5770 is officially a fossil or a relic of the previous generation of PC gaming. It can still run esports styles with surprising results, but the 1GB of VRAM is really an Achilles heel, even with the games like Dota 2 and CSGO. If you're looking for a used budget GPU, I would not recommend these in the slightest. Look elsewhere like a used mining RX 470 for $50 perhaps. And as to what I'll do with the card in the future, I think I'll just keep it as a trophy of sorts. It symbolizes my entry to PC gaming and the thousands of hours I've enjoyed along the way. So with that being said, leave a like on the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want more content like this, and I'll see you all in the next video.